Okay, good morning, everyone. I hope you all had a wonderful weekend in the sun because it was a great one. It's the first day we've walked over here with the sun in our eyes in a while. So thank you. Welcome for being here. It is Tuesday, February 6th. This is the House Democratic Caucus. I'm going to do just a couple of announcements, not many, and then we'll move on to some bill reports or topics. First thing is, I keep telling you every week that we're going to change our afternoon floor time, but we're not doing that yet. Just this morning we found out that we will probably have 2 weeks notice on the change in floor time. So this week it is going to be 10, 3, 3, and 9:30. Next week will be 10, 3, 3, and 9:30. But listen next week because the week after that will probably, not no guarantee, go to 1 o'clock instead of 3 for Wednesday and Thursday. So stay tuned. It all depends on how fast legislation is moving through your committees. So we're holding on that and through the Senate as well. Okay, the only other announcement I have is there is a joint rules meeting tomorrow in the Speaker's office at 8:45. And that is for the House and the Senate to set crossover dates. So stay tuned after that meeting. We will know when our crossover dates are in March. And I believe that is it. Okay. So first up, I'm going to call up Representative Kornheiser, who's going to give us an update on education finance. Or anybody else she wants to bring with her. Sorry, I didn't know. There he is. And Representative Conlon too.
Come on up. Yeah. Hi.
Hi.
How's it going?
All right.
Good, good. We're here again to talk about school budgets. We don't have new sort of breaking news to report, but just want to sort of give an update on our process for people. So again, know that lots of people are hearing from school officials. I know that this is an incredibly, schools are under tremendous pressure just on a day-to-day basis in their districts, in the classroom, and in this fiscal environment. And that by having these conversations publicly, we are actually like creating more feelings of instability. It is also how a solid deliberative democracy works, right? We are communicating with the field. We are asking you to communicate with your districts. We are asking you to communicate with your constituents about this. And so not having answers immediately is scary and destabilizing for folks, but it's also how we can get the very best feedback about the path forward. And so just sort of want to name that's that we're aware of that. So I'm also going to rehash a few things that I think we've said up here before, but for anyone who's sort of tuning in for the first time, want to make sure that you have some background. Do you want to like take turns doing that? Okay. This year we've heard from school boards from towns and cities across the state that they're struggling to create budgets that both meet student needs and that simultaneously are reasonable for taxpayers. It is not for lack of trying. School boards are working tirelessly for Vermont's kids. Well, maybe they are actually tired too. And we're grateful to them for their work and for engaging with all of us lawmakers in the process so that we can find ways to help. Our priorities in the Ways and Means and Education committees are twofold. Supporting Vermont taxpayers and supporting Vermont's children. And that's why we're collaborating so deeply on this as committee. How did we get here to this point? A few things. It's an unprecedented year in education as we deal with the aftermath of the pandemic, the cost pressures of inflation. And these are things that in each of these things in a more traditional budget year would each be significant and all together have led us to the moment we're at. So at its essence, why are tax rates expected to go up? It's because non-property tax revenue is down and education costs are facing unprecedented increases. So at the end of the day, the education fund is a closed loop and tax rates go up when spending goes up. It's just all of the math inside there is complex. So during and since the pandemic, the education fund has had greater revenue from increased sales and use tax revenue. We use that money in two ways. We added to reserve funds in order to buy down rates in the future, like this year, and we use the remainder to protect taxpayers from rising property tax rates in past years. So education spending was going up in past years, but we were able to keep tax rates steady because we had unexpected higher than normal revenues because we were all out spending our federal tax rebates on things like, I don't know, whatever you all bought. So in addition, we also had federal pandemic funds that were supporting learning loss. The ESSER money, and that money has run out. So districts were spending on needed needs and increased absenteeism, mental health challenges, all of those things. Those are still happening, but the federal money is gone. We also know that real estate values have gone up considerably. This increases our statewide grand list. So that's the base, the tax base, which actually lowers rates. Still need to raise the same amount of money though. And then that gets sort of adjusted on the other end of the algebraic equation, and we see that in our CLA. So that makes everything feel higher or lower depending on where you are. But at the end of the day, we spend more, we need to raise more in taxes because property taxes are sort of how we cover the needs of the education fund. Schools have even more pressures to address today. Again, employee shortages, inflationary pressures, challenging nature of the work, the need to increase employee pay to face all those needs. Healthcare costs are increasing by double digits across the state, not just for education. Supply costs, heating costs, transportation costs. We have a lot of people who move to wood chip boilers. Wood chip costs are even up, right? And we're seeing all of that globally, and schools are, you know, a microcosm of everything that happens in our communities, both dollar-wise and life-wise. So as a result, education spending is proposed in the latest numbers we got from the Agency of Education for warned budgets this year, which has the sum of almost every warned budget in the state. We are expecting education spending to go up by an unprecedented $250 million statewide. That is above even the forecast in the December 1st letter, quite a bit above. So using the rough estimate that we've used in past years, that 1 cent in property taxes raises about $10 million. That's about sort of 25 cents statewide, right? That is the foundation of why rates are expected to go up. We also have this unexpected quirk this year, which is the 5% tax cap that was put in under Act 127 in order to protect taxpayers that were losing a tremendous amount of tax capacity in a single year. That particular mechanism of using a 5% cap rather than, say, a discount has become untenable because as property taxes have risen for all of those other reasons I've explained, it's bringing every district in the state under that 5% to hit that 5% cap. Every district in the state at this point has hit that 5% cap. And as one district comes in under it, because we have a contained education fund, all of the other districts' rates go up and they become closer to hitting it. So it's not working as designed because it was really designed just for those few districts that were experiencing significant losses in tax capacity as a result of Act 127. It also means, so it's basically become meaningless. It's doing more harm than good. It's going to push non-homestead tax rates up significantly across the board because that's the only release valve. That's rental properties, that's commercial properties.
Many of you have received letters from school boards and superintendents saying, you've got to keep the cap. We did all our calculations on the cap. It's if we take away the cap, this is going to happen. Well, those calculations are no longer valid because everybody's over the cap. It's a closed system where you got to raise money on itself to fund that difference. And so, you know, we continue to hear people saying we got to keep the cap. Well, the only way to keep the cap and make those calculations actually still work is to infuse the education fund with money that doesn't exist, a huge amount of money.
I mean, just an absolutely impossible amount of money. And right now, the way the cap works and with everyone hitting it, districts can't cut spending in order to cut tax rates. It actually just doesn't work anymore, though, of course, it worked every other year. So we want to, again, acknowledge the mistake that we made in this particular piece of Act 127. Because Act 127 was designed to increase tax equity. And this mechanism keeps us from having the kind of tax equity we were looking for. So we want to change that mechanism so that budgets can reflect the reality of the taxes that would be connected to them. And so that we can all ideally have property taxes that we are all able to pay across the state. So this is sort of an all hands on deck moment. We are working with our partners in the Senate very closely. We are working with the administration very closely, with the Agency of Education and the Department of Taxes to find a path forward. What it is looking like right now is the best way we can essentially mitigate the impacts of for those districts who lost a lot of tax capacity while still preserving an education fund that essentially has linear relationships between the numbers, is to move to using a cents discount. That's plural, more than 1 cent. Hard word to say, cents. But to use a discount for tax rates in those districts that have been impacted rather than using a cap. And our committee is going to take that up this afternoon and have that conversation this afternoon. And we're doing that so that we can restore the relationship between budgets and tax rates. And so that if districts do want to make changes in their budgets, given what they now know about what other district spending looks like, what impact that will have on their tax rates, because remember, every district spending impact every other district tax rate, they will be able to make new decisions about what their budgets will look like and what their tax rates would look like for voters. As we have that conversation, we know that this is the middle of budget season, and it's a really hard time to make changes. We think we do need to make changes because of all of what I described, and that essentially at this point with what we know, the budgets that are warned don't actually connect to the tax rates that are assumed. And so we don't have accurate information in the field right now. And so what we're hoping to do as we make changes from using a cap mechanism to a cents discount mechanism, that we will give voters a chance to rewarn, we'll give districts a chance to rewarn their budgets if they need to, and we'll put in statutory language around that too. Again, know that this is a time of a lot of, it's hard to be in the middle of change, and those are the times that we're living in right now. So we're looking at 3 steps. I'm going to move into 3 steps. Okay. So we're looking at 3 steps. This first step is like the immediate step of changing the transition mechanism and supporting districts to do what they need to do to their budgets with, dollars for if new printing is required or new space rental or new counting machines or whatever. Like, it just sort of costs money to make changes in a vote. And so making sure the Secretary of State's office is ready to support that. Changing the cap, that's step 1. And that will allow us to basically do other things with the education fund that make sense. Step 2 would be looking at the reality of what education spending then is this year and figuring out how we can mitigate impacts for voters and for taxpayers. Not all taxpayers vote, right? So ways we can mitigate impact might look at making sure we understand the income adjustment. The majority of Vermonters pay on their property taxes on income rather than on the value of their property. So we're going to look at ways we can adjust that to make sure we are protecting those taxpayers. Look at ways that we might need to put some new revenue into the education funds, sort of things for FY25, further steps for FY25. And then step 3 is focusing on the kind of transformational change we're going to need for FY26 and beyond to make sure that we're really getting our arms around what is happening in our schools and what's happening with education spending. Do you want to say things about step 3?
Well, step 3 is a concept that's not clearly defined, but it's clear that because of this perfect storm, it's time to take a hard look at what we're doing and how we're doing it. We have a system where Our job in the legislature is to fund whatever the local decisions are making. So it's a state-funded program over which the state exercises very little control other than rules and regulations. And so we need to look at that relationship. How can we have sort of state goals for education, but local control, and make those work better together? And clearly, when you look at the cost of education, especially after this year, we need to look at strategies to figure out why that is. Is the education fund picking up too much of the cost of social programs? But also look at ways that we can tame that. And so we've, one part of that big issue is already started when we talk about school construction aid. Our committee's getting deep into the work of creating a construction aid program, because we know of this huge need for construction out there. And it's also it would be a state-run program that can employ tools that provide incentives to sort of move our education system in a direction that is more responsive to the needs of the 21st century.
And so those examples like that for step 3, we know that people are spending money on facilities and construction that's coming out of education spending right now, but it's not as strategic or impactful as it could be. And so moving those costs long-term into a specific construction funding program, as we've had in the past, is strategy. Another one, we know that schools right now are spending a huge amount of money on mental health out of education spending. We have a whole system of designated mental health agencies that are funded through the general fund. What would it look like to match that up a little better? And we know that the Education Committee and the Healthcare Committee have already started that work. So those are some examples of step 3. But right now, we're working on step 2, we're working on step 3, but step 1, we're hoping to really do this week. Our committee is gonna look at the modeling this afternoon. Ways and Means and Education are going to look at the modeling this afternoon and make some decisions about what comes next, and then hoping to have legislation that can move quite quickly so that districts will have the information they need to make the decisions that they need to make for their voters. Thanks.
Thank you, Chip Troiano from Standard. So how much effect does our CLA impacting this whole situation? And is there a way to mitigate that in some way so that it doesn't, if it is impacting it? I know I got a call yesterday from our appraisal company saying, oh, can't do it this year, got to wait till next year. And our CLA is going to tank. And generally that means there's an issue with your tax rate. So are there any thoughts or talk about that?
So last year, the Ways and Means Committee and our body passed H480 that did a significant amount of work to restructure how we do appraisals and reappraisals in our communities. And so we're beginning that process. It's going to take a number of years to have that bear the kind of fruit we're looking for. Once that work is finished, it will have a significant it will minimize the impact of CLAs if we even decide to maintain the CLA as an adjustment mechanism. But again, that's a few years out. In the meantime, I am working harder every day to see if I could get better at using algebra out loud to a large group of people, but I still have not made the full progress on teaching algebra that I hope to. What I will say is that the CLA and the grand list are working together all the time. And so as an example, if we decided to just say revert back to last year's CLA, because that would make people happy, what that would mean is that we would need to have a corresponding reduction in the total grand list for the state. And that would mean that the base tax rate would need to go up. And so at the end of the day, it's still the same amount of money we need to raise from the same number of taxpayers. And so we can see it pre-CLA tax rate, or we can see it at the post-CLA tax rate, but it's still the same amount of money for the same number of voters. And I would add that because the CLA is so significant in every district this year, it's less about sort of how recently you've reappraised and more just that it's happening to everyone statewide. Yeah. Yeah, and so that's something that long-term we're working on, but I will tell you that the way it connects to tax rates is sort of accounted for at the beginning as well as in the end.
I was thinking about it as if you were to apply the CLA to the grand list rather than to the tax rate, then nobody might even notice and get up in arms about it, even though it has the exact same effect.
Thank you. Could you, this is concerning changing from the cap to the discount. Could you explain in very simple terms, either now or follow up with an email to folks, discount to whom and what, I mean, just how, what that means, so I can turn around and others can turn around and say that you know, once you've made that decision, and I know you haven't, you're considering that at this point, but thank you.
So we're gonna work on this in committee this afternoon, and so it might be best explained after that happens and more eyes and minds have gotten their heads around it. But basically, we've used sort of mechanisms like this before, and you have sort of the towns or you have the district's tax rate, which is X number of cents on your property tax bill. It goes up 4 decimal points, for instance. And that cent discount would be applied almost as if you, before you even got your bill. So it'd be basically like the Agency of Education would say, so your tax rate is expected, these are random numbers that just make good math. Okay, example math, no one hold on to these numbers. But let's say your tax rate is $2.25 this year, which would be sort of applied to your total property, right? Then a discount would bring it down to $2 this year. And that would happen before before taxpayers got their bills. It would happen at the state level.
We did a somewhat, not totally similar thing with Act 46 for those districts that merged in the preferred model. They got a 10-cent discount off their property tax rate, and then it diminished over 5 years.
And this would have we are imagining that this would be a transition out over 5 years. It wouldn't be, it would be one discount this year and then a lesser discount next year and onward.
Hi, Sarah Coffey from Guilford. Just a quick question. Is the committee considering making any changes to income sensitivity, or is there any analysis of how that's impacting? I know so many of my constituents and probably many constituents, are involved in that program. And so just wondering if that's something that the committee is considering.
The majority of taxpayers in Vermont pay their education taxes based on income rather than on the value of their property. And that is part of our step 2. So once we change the transition mechanism so that we can restore the linear nature of the education fund, then our committee will absolutely look at how we can make sure that the income adjustment works well this year, given the difference between this year and last.
Town and school reports are at the printers as we speak. Warnings, deadlines are rapidly approaching. How are we going to deal with that?
We're working really closely with the Secretary of State's office to support towns and the Government Operations Committee. We will be working closely with them to make sure that we are giving the appropriate permissive language so that budgets can be rewarned and votes can be pushed out if needed. And we will also make sure that we are attaching an appropriation to that. So if there's additional costs from needing to reprint or print new materials or, rent a local community center in order to have a new vote, that all of those costs can be covered. And I think we did something like that with the pandemic. Thank you.
Hi, Edie Granning, Jericho. I'm just wondering, as conditions have changed so much on the ground, if there's any discussion, conversation about delaying implementation of Act 127, or even looking at that as part of what the new model is, if even going forward with it makes sense right now.
There is not any discussion of postponing Act 127 implementation. It was at least a decade in the making. It was deeply deliberated, deeply considered, and the educational equity and the tax equity that will come as a result of this is still very clear in the model. Thank you. Thanks.
Just remind you the same thing I always say, watch this, because obviously we just heard there's more testimony happening this afternoon. This is an unfolding as our days go by. Reach out to anyone on Ways and Means or on the Education Committee or anyone in leadership if you have questions. Thank you. Thank you. And reach out to Representative Conlon or Kornheiser as well. All right. Thanks, folks. Up next, I'm going to call on, am I calling on you? Is it okay? I'm going to call on Representative Justin Tangeman, who's going to speak on, I'm going to tell you while he's walking up here, 751. Thank you, which is coming up sometime.
Well, that's a tough act to follow. Yes, I'm going to speak briefly about H 751, which will be on the floor tomorrow. It is a pay discrimination act or a pay non-discrimination act. And very briefly, what it does is last year in S-103, we added a number of protections to the Fair Employment Practices Act. Previously, you couldn't discriminate on pay based on race, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, or age. We added a number of other categories banning discrimination on color, religion, place of birth, crime victim status. If the individual is a qualified individual with a disability who can do the job with reasonable accommodation, and ancestry. So we added that. That's done, completed law. What 751 does is align that list of protected categories in the Fair Employment Practices Act with a later subsection, which is the equal pay, protecting against equal pay discrimination. So it aligns the protected categories in those two sections. And really the reason for it is that we keep finding, due to human nature, if you know, some people are always looking for some workaround. And we can't just broadly say gender, race, and religion. We need to fine tune it for legal standing, legal protections, and that is the purpose of this bill. Short and sweet. Thank you.
Are there any questions, comments? Thoughts? Around the book. Okay. Don't forget to reach out to anyone on House General or Representative Chestnut Tangeman if you have questions. I'm going to call Representative Lalonde up here, who's going to give us a general update from judiciary and then speak to H 563, which is car-related crimes, and H 780, which is judicial nominating. Did I cover that?
Thank you. Good morning. Sorry. I'm living in the future. So the Judiciary Committee, we've been working really hard this session on public safety and access to justice. Probably the main work to actually advance our public safety is actually in the Appropriations Committee. We've been working really hard to understand the needs of the criminal justice system, the prosecutors, the defenders, the courts, the victim advocates, the CJCs, et cetera. And the purpose of that is to deal with a backlog of cases, a significant backlog, which has the impact of having consequences for criminal activity being far removed from the criminal activity. Misdemeanors are taking months, if not years, to resolve, and there really isn't much of a deterrent effect if you are not having consequences near the time of the offenses. And when I am talking about consequences, I'm not just meaning incarceration. It's really working with the individuals. It can be treatment, mental health treatment, substance abuse treatment. It can be deferred sentences. It can be probation. There's all sorts of different paths, but there needs to be consequences for certain criminal behavior. And I will also just back up really quickly, as I try to always say when I explain this, is that the Judiciary Committee is at the end of the pipeline. Really where most of our attention needs to be is for prevention, is treatment availability, dealing with poverty, dealing with people who are unhoused, which are all potential drivers of crime. That's not to say that somebody who's unhoused is going to commit crimes, but there is a correlation there. But nevertheless, we deal with the end of the pipeline after somebody has been involved in criminal behavior, and really to have a deterrence effect in the criminal justice system, you need to have consequences occur soon. So in any event, that's really work that we are working closely with the Appropriations Committee to understand what resources are needed. In the interim, we're also working on 4 different bills that address different aspects of the public safety issue. 2 of them I will explain further next week, because I'm hoping by next week we'll be voting them out. One has to do with retail theft, which I won't get into the details right now because it may change by next week. The other has to do with expanding access to restorative justice, primarily with respect to what's called pre-charge diversion, where law enforcement directly refers individuals who have run into trouble with the law directly to a provider of restorative justice services. That's been really one of our primary efforts. It will help as far as the outcomes for individuals, but also will take some pressure off the courts in dealing with the backlog. So this week, I'm hoping, and it's likely that we'll be passing 2 bills on Thursday, which means that they will be on the floor on Tuesday morning before the next caucus. That's why I just want to quickly explain what they are. One of the reasons, yes.
You don't know this, but there is a frozen camera, but so I'm sure you're all seeing the frozen camera, but the sound is still there. So we're continuing to do this and not interrupting beyond this. Camera's frozen, but we can still hear you.
They can't see me and they can see the audience? Okay, all right. Well, thank you. No, thank you. So, H780 deals with an issue tangentially related, well, actually directly related to the backlog, but it's really much more forward-looking. Part of the reason that we've gotten behind with court cases is there's been a lot of vacancies, judge vacancies over the last couple of years. So the committee has looked at how can we improve our judicial nominating process. And this bill that we are likely to pass out this Thursday morning does a couple things. It works to expand the applicant pool so there can be more applicants, a more diverse applicant pool. I won't go into the details of how that works now, but that's one of the main thrusts of this bill is some diversity in a broader applicant pool. The other deals with a ambiguity in the Constitution as far as whether the governor can reject a list that the nominating board provides of candidates, and how many times the governor can reject the list and ask for more individuals. We're going to have essentially say you can ask for one more list and that's it. And we feel that that will deal with this ambiguity. So the other bill is when there are various nefarious actions related to automobiles. And there's some gaps in law that we've learned about. And there's actually been a pretty significant increase of larceny into motor vehicles and auto theft. And these are, this is one bill, H563, which actually combines 3 bills dealing with similar issues that were introduced. The first part of the bill deals with attempted motor vehicle theft. It actually decreases the penalty for attempted motor vehicle theft, grand larceny of motor vehicles, with the idea that it's going to be pursued more often. That's not really the heart of it. The main parts of the bill, one has to do with trespass. Currently, if you see on your driveway camera, somebody in your car, just sitting in there, maybe they've rummaged around a lot, but they haven't taken anything. The law enforcement can't do anything about that. There has to, unless you've put a do not trespass sign on your vehicle, which seems odd, or if you specifically told that person, get out of my vehicle, and the person doesn't. Well, we think that doesn't make sense. So this bill says that if an individual should have known or knew that this didn't have consent to be in the car, then that's a misdemeanor. And they don't have to have notice that, that the car is not theirs. And we're gonna, all right, so there's the green Subaru problem in the airport parking lot, that you accidentally get into the green Subaru that's not yours. Should you have known? Well, there's a good argument of whether you should have known or not. We actually trust prosecutors' discretion on that one, and are not too concerned about that. The final thing it does is driving without the consent of the owner, essentially taking a car for a joyride or stealing it. Currently, the person has to know that there wasn't consent. And it's been easy for situations, the law enforcement told us this, that it's pretty easy for them to, well, let me put it this way, it's difficult, very difficult for the prosecutor to prove that there wasn't consent, that the person didn't know that there was consent. So we're using a standard of, we're putting in a standard of should have known or known that you didn't have consent to drive the vehicle. So, and that would also be a 3-year misdemeanor. So we're dealing with the auto theft. We are still in the process of dealing with retail theft. We're giving an off-ramp in our pre-charge diversion bill, and we're trying to make it so we don't have these vacancies down the road. Meanwhile, I'm hoping the appropriations will give us all the money we're asking for. I'm happy to answer questions.
Remember to introduce yourselves when you wrap them up.
Peter Conlon from Cornwall. You just said that operating without the owner's consent, you would be bumped to still being a misdemeanor.
So if it's a knowing standard, if somebody knew they aren't supposed to be operating, it would be a 2-year misdemeanor. If it's a should have known standard, which would be new, we would have a 3-month misdemeanor.
At what point does stealing a car become a felony?
That's a good question. I think that would be under the grand larceny offense. And, I'm not exactly sure what.
Aggravated show that there was no intent to return the vehicle.
Right.
I think that's a felony.
Apparently, we didn't get to that part of that offense. Thank you, Chip, for knowing that.
So my question is, the attempted larceny of a motor vehicle, is that a misdemeanor or is it planned to be?
It's a 5-year instead of a 10-year. Normally attempt law, you match
Right.
what the underlying offense would be. And this actually reduces it from 10 years, which is what grand larceny is.
So it remains
to
a
5.
felony.
It remains a felony, but it's a 5-year felony.
Thank you. Thanks, Martin. I had a question about the judicial Representative Ray Garofano of Essex. The judicial nomination process, Bill, did you all consider giving the governor a time limit to actually appoint the judges?
We did, and didn't find any witness who thought that would work. So, and we defer to what we hear from witnesses largely.
Yeah, all right, so if anybody has any questions, reach out to Judiciary or Representative Lalonde, anyone on Judiciary. That's it for today. It's all I've got. Have a great week, everyone. Thank you.